So the idea that cultures are never static influenced my work on the Tohono O'odham Nation when I was looking at traditional foods on the Tohono O'odham Nation. And I had a number of different individuals that were on my committee that were from different disciplines. So there were a couple of anthropologists, but there were also individuals from law as well as individuals from natural resources type setting. And so when I'd gone in and started to put together my questions on the Tohono O'odham Nation in unison with individuals from the nation themselves in different types of settings, one of the first questions to emerge was the idea of what actually constituted traditional foods, because in fact there were multiple understandings of traditional foods, and foods that had been around for very long periods of time were brought into the category of traditional, along with foods that had been introduced by the Spanish, the interplay with Spanish and Mexican culture in the greater Southwest region, including southern Arizona, as well as the influence of U.S. commodity foods, particularly things like flour and lard, comprising fry bread, which many informants, particularly those younger informants, identified as traditional foods overall. So again, this is even going to the starting points with the types of questions that we're going to ask and what we're going to consider overall, and how this contributes to our discussions of the field. There have been other potential avenues for discussing the traditional and what that means. And if anthropologists embrace this notion of the traditional and reinforce this notion of the traditional and put this out there as a static entity. This is what's become known as the idea of strategic essentialism, where essentialist ideas are utilized that these indigenous people act in a particular way because it's their tradition, it's what they do, which doesn't allow for change over time. It also potentially defines individuals as having a particular set of characteristics, so that in the absence of those characteristics, they then lose the right to claim particular aspects of their identity. For example, if I was doing, when doing my work on the Tohono O'odham Nation, if I asked individuals about what they consider to be traditional foods or not, I could then rank them on a scale of these individuals are supposedly more O'odham than others, or in fact that they are O'odham, whereas other individuals had been acculturated to the point that they are in fact no longer considered to be Tohono O'odham. So there's some danger with this use of tradition as a whole, as a rhetorical device in our field work, as well as in our activist work, as we're looking to modify and adjust current systems of and structures of power. And indeed, this was one of the things that many postmodernists sought to do, is they sought to institute some type of change overall. So if you look at the bottom here, the last statement here, that the approach can be used to speak truth to power, but at the same time, the postmodernist approach can also slide into nihilism, deriving from Nietzsche's work, wherein all voices need to be heard and included, and that is including the oppressors that need to be heard. Again, from Heidegger's work in Hermetics, you can see the potential here to hear all voices, including those that would dispossess, alienate, and marginalize entire sections of society based on characteristics, socially defined characteristics and stigma. So we've seen this along the lines of, for example, Marx's discussion of class, Weber's work on class status and party, but also in the context of race and racism, nationality and nationalism as well. So there's a variety or multitude of ways which this can be felt. So some of the other critiques of postmodernism is that it becomes very close to turning anthropology into a subfield of literature. And if you remember from earlier, this was some of the same critique that was coming out of the symbolic and interpretive anthropologist as a whole. So the critique goes that if all writing is nothing more than interpretations of interpretations, then in fact ethnography is in fact fiction. And if it's fiction, then no conclusions can ultimately be reached about anything. So McGee and Worms give the example of ketchup and an ice cream. And so I take that example here a little bit with some artistic license. And so what can be said if someone says, I saw Fazino students pour mustard on custard? As McGee and Worms point out, who really cares? What can postmodernists actually say? And so the postmodernist approach has been accused as looking inward, being overly reflexive, and not really saying anything uh, about the human condition in an anthropological frame. Again, it stands outside of anthropology. Uh, this notion of reflexivity taken to its maximum extent, that in fact, the only thing that can be said is about one's own individual experiences. So this is again the critique of postmodernism, the idea of navel gazing as a whole. Jacques Derrida, a French philosopher, again, all of these guys were trained by Althusser, who had a philosopher with a Marxist approach, and they all departed to a greater or lesser extent from his work. Uh, Particularly with their disillusionment with the politics of France at the time, and the critiques of the leftist government, as well as French continued French occupation in Algeria, as well as in other contexts, and became very critical of Marxist uh, work overall. So Derrida is known for primarily for his work on deconstruction. This is the key concept of Jacques Derrida. For Derrida, deconstruction is the practice of finding and interpreting ruptures, which are zones of conflict or logical inconsistency, in order to reveal the underlying cultural assumptions or repressed voices. And what Derrida essentially maintained is that in writing and speech, certain voices are licensed, wherein some sort of authority is granted to those voices. Uh, and other voices are delicensed. And in fact, the process of licensing some voices necessarily implies a delicensing of others. That is, one can speak from a position of expertise beyond reproach of others. For Derrida, all cultures construct autonomous, self-contained worlds of meaning. And as autonomous, self-contained worlds of meaning, ethnographic descriptions will necessarily fall short. They will, in fact, distort Native understandings by forcing them into our own society's way of conceptualizing the world. And Arjuna Apadarai noted this in his Place and Voice in Anthropological Theory, which is a short intro to some of the works based around a session, I believe it was in the 1980s, at the American Anthropological Association. And he notes that until there are as many ethnographers from the Philippines writing about the experiences in the context of Philadelphia as vice versa, anthropology can never claim any sort of neutrality as a whole. But Derrida would in fact go further than this, noting that the processes of deconstruction are not in themselves necessarily beyond reproach. That is, you could have deconstructions of deconstructions themselves. And here you can see some of the critique in terms of this idea of navel gazing or inward looking and the discipline as a whole. But, I mean, it raises an interesting question, because if the purpose of anthropology is to understand the human condition, at what scale can we as anthropologists seek to examine and consider the human condition? Can we actually consider the human condition at the level of cultures and comparative cross-cultural comparison approach? Or is the level of scale more intimate, more personal, as Edith Turner might suggest in her work promoting a humanistic anthropology, coming to know oneself in the context of interaction with others. And those others might not necessarily be those of disparate cultures, but one's own cultural background and understanding. So for Derrida, meaning can never be accurately translated. The processes of licensing and delicensing occur in Deconstruction as well as in other texts themselves. Jacques Derrida, just as a side note here, Jacques Derrida, in one of his final interviews that he does, he's sitting in front of his massive library, and by massive I mean massive, multiple floors, and the interviewer asks Derrida, "Have you read all of these?" And he says something along the lines of, "I've only read a couple of these books, but I've read them very well." So it was an interesting quote. I think that goes to his this other quote here that he has at the bottom of the bottom of the picture here. Uh, Moving on, Michel Foucault, French philosopher like Derrida, trained with Althusser. He looks at the relationship between systems of knowledge and systems of power and social control. Foucault's early work was interested in mental institutions which create languages of inclusion and exclusion that reflect and support the social order. In his book, Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason, first published in French in 1961, and an abridged edition published in English in 1964, he lays out the evolution of madness as a whole. It should be pointed out that the original French edition is published in a complete English translation not until 2006 and is called History of Madness. Nevertheless, in Madness and Civilization, The History of Madness, Foucault traces the evolutionary history of madness through three distinct phases: the Renaissance, the 17th and 18th century, and the modern experience. And in each of these, he looks at the extent to which the idea of madness is incorporated into overall discussions of civilization and vice versa. His later work he defines as, and others have talked about this, as a genealogical tracing of the histories of systems of knowledge used by the powerful in order to understand the relationship between power and knowledge and its connection with actual practices. He's most notable for the 1969 publication, The Archaeology of Knowledge, and the subsequent English translation in 1972. In his four-volume work, The History of Sexuality, which begins in 1978 with Volume 1, he looks at sexuality and how it's been dealt with over time historically. Sexuality has not been repressed in Western society. That is, discussions of sexuality have not been repressed in Western society, despite what we might believe. Rather, they have been drawn out, and this is from the excerpt from McGee and Worms, who talk about this in more detail in terms of the incitement to discourse. So the discussion of sexuality is in fact central to how Europeans understand their society, as well as to defining membership in sexual minorities as a whole. And again, as looking at the historical evolution of these ideas, Foucault examines the 18th and 19th century with the emergence of science in particular, and how this helps to create a change in the discourse of sexuality as a whole. Homosexuals began to be identified as a group possessing specific characteristics. And Foucault brings up the point that homosexuality changed from something that a person did to something that a person was. So this is a rather interesting work looking at the history of sexuality overall and its evolution over time, and essentially how science is brought to the fore here to problematize particular behaviors and to define a group or category based upon those behaviors, providing an overall rational framework. And again, this is the work that Foucault is doing, is he's tracing the histories of these systems of knowledge, of what the institutions at the time are doing in order to inculcate in individuals particular types of knowledge of what they should be concerned about, how they should monitor their own sexuality and the sexuality of others in a variety of ways.